The persistent inquiry maintained its night cycle between 2200 and 600 hours, the 8-hour period that the vessel's operational schedule designated as the crew's primary rest phase, and that the vessel's environmental system supported through the specific atmospheric and lighting adjustments that simulated the diurnal rhythm that both human and Calithi biology required for sustained health during long-duration missions. The night cycle was the ship's quietest period. The corridors dimmed to the amber low light that the environmental systems used to signal rest phase, the operational noise reduced to the ambient hum of systems running at maintenance level, the social activity that the ship's common spaces generated during active hours replaced by the settled, dormant quality of a vessel whose crew was, for the most part, sleeping. Compartment 7C was located in the portside crew berthing section, the area of the vessel that the spatial planning had designated for paired crew quarters. The compartments arranged along the corridor, with the efficient, space-maximizing layout that ship architecture applied to crew accommodations when the architecture's priorities were function and density, rather than comfort and privacy. The compartment was small. The word was accurate without being adequate. The space contained 2 bunks, upper and lower, stacked in the configuration that the designation bunk implied. A shared storage unit, a narrow floor space that permitted one person to stand between the bunks and the storage unit without requiring the other person to be elsewhere, and the environmental control panel that governed the compartment's atmospheric conditions. The space was sufficient for 2 people to sleep, to store personal effects, and to coexist in the specific, negotiated manner that shared quarters required when the people sharing them were adults whose personal space preferences exceeded what the space provided. Declan Sawyer was asleep in the lower bunk. The lower bunk was his, the assignment established on day 1 of the mission, and maintained across 6 months through the unspoken agreement that bunk assignments, once established, were inviolable. The territorial claim that shared quarters residents maintained with the particular firmness that people applied to the small territories they controlled when the controlling was the only spatial autonomy their living situation provided. The lower bunk was his territory, his blanket was his blanket, his pillow was his pillow. The thermal envelope that the lower bunk's configuration created, the enclosed, insulated space that the bunk's walls, ceiling, the underside of the upper bunk, and his thermal blanket produced, was his thermal envelope, calibrated to his preference through 6 months of habitation, and carrying the specific warmth that his body generated, and that the envelope retained with the efficiency that enclosed sleeping spaces provided. He was 31. He slept the way that people who worked physical jobs on ships slept, deeply, efficiently, the body using the rest phase with the purposeful consumption that physical labor demanded, and that the body's recovery systems pursued with the biological urgency that sustained physical work produced. His sleeping posture was the posture of a man whose body was large enough to find the lower bunk's dimensions a negotiation. 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders and chest, the frame of an engineer whose work involved the physical engagement that ship maintenance required, and that the engagement had built into the kind of body that occupied sleeping spaces fully. The shoulders and torso and legs filling the bunk's available dimensions with the comfortable, settled quality of a body that had been filling this specific bunk for 6 months, and whose filling was habitual. He was warm. The warmth was not exceptional. It was the standard thermal output that human physiology produced, the metabolic heat generation that warm-blooded biology maintained as a continuous, unconscious process. The body burning caloric energy to sustain the core temperature that human cellular function required, and that the burning produced as a byproduct the radiative thermal energy that the body emitted through the skin's surface into the surrounding environment. The thermal output was approximately 100 watts, the equivalent of a modest space heater running continuously. The biological furnace that human evolution had built for the purpose of maintaining function in the variable temperature environments that Earth's climate produced, and that the furnace's continuous operation made humans, in thermal terms, self-contained heating units that radiated warmth into whatever space they occupied. The lower bunk was warm because Declan was warm. The thermal blanket retained the warmth because thermal blankets retained warmth. The thermal envelope was, by any reasonable assessment, extremely comfortable, the enclosed space maintaining a temperature that Declan's body found ideal because his body was the temperature's source, and the source's ideal was the temperature it produced. He woke at 300 hours. The waking was not the gradual, natural emergence that the sleep cycle's completion produced. It was the abrupt, stimulus-driven waking that occurred when the sleeping brain detected something in the environment that the environment was not supposed to contain. The something was pressure, weight, the specific physical sensation of another body occupying the space that his body occupied, the lower bunk's available dimensions, already negotiated to their limit by his frame, suddenly containing additional mass that the dimensions had not been designed to accommodate, and that the additional mass's presence communicated through the medium of physical contact that the bunk size made unavoidable. Declan's brain transitioned from sleep to waking with the speed that the stimulus demanded and the confusion that the stimulus produced. Someone was in his bunk. The someone was not a something, not a shifted piece of equipment, not a displaced storage item, but a person, a body, present in the lower bunk space in a position that the position's configuration communicated as deliberate habitation rather than accidental contact. He registered the details in the order that waking perception provided them. The body was smaller than his, significantly, the differential in mass and dimension registering as the specific, immediate recognition that the person in the bunk was not another human of comparable size, but a person of different proportions. The body was cold. The skin that was in contact with his arm through the thin fabric of a sleep garment, carrying a temperature that his thermal perception registered as below normal, below comfortable, below the range that healthy biology maintained. The body was calithi, the skin's texture, the proportions, the specific physical characteristics that 6 months of shared quarters had made familiar enough to identify through the limited sensory input that the dark bunk's enclosed space provided. The body was Caliph Vorsarin, his compartment-mate, the senior research analyst, the person whose upper bunk was directly above his lower bunk, and whose presence in the upper bunk was so consistent and so territorial and so absolutely maintained that the consistency had become one of the compartment's defining constants, as reliable as the environmental control panel's location, and as predictable as the ambient hum of the ventilation system. She was not in her upper bunk. She was in his lower bunk. She was curled against his side with the specific, compact configuration of a body that had arranged itself for maximum contact with a heat source. The fetal position, adapted for thermal acquisition. The body's surface area minimized on the side facing away from the heat and maximized on the side facing toward it. The configuration that cold bodies adopted when they found warmth, and when the finding produced the instinctive, biological response of getting as close to the warmth as the body could manage. Declan lay in the dark and processed the situation with the cognitive tools that 300 hours and the transition from deep sleep provided, which was to say the tools were functioning, but the functioning was not at peak capacity, and the situation's requirements were exceeding whatever capacity the tools provided. Caliph Vorsarin was in his bunk. Caliph Vorsarin, the woman whose professional reputation was built on cold precision and absolute personal boundaries, the woman who maintained a minimum conversational distance of 4 feet in all interactions, and whose maintenance of the distance had been so consistent across 6 months that the crew had developed the informal measurement unit of 1 caliph to describe the social space that people maintained when they did not want to be approached. The woman whose personal boundary adherence was the ship's most reliable social constant was currently pressed against his side, with the thermal acquisition posture of a person who had found a heat source, and whose body had arranged itself around the source with the instinctive, biological purposefulness that cold bodies produced when the cold was severe enough to override the conscious controls that the conscious mind typically maintained. He needed to wake her. The conclusion was obvious. She had entered the wrong bunk during night shift exhaustion, the fatigue of extended crisis management shifts producing the navigational error that placed her in the lower bunk rather than the upper, and the error needed to be corrected before the correction's delay produced the awkwardness that the delay's extension would generate. The correction needed to be performed carefully, because the person being corrected was the person whose professional identity would be most damaged by the correction's circumstances, and the damage required the care that preventing it demanded. "Caliph," he said. His voice was pitched for the specific task of waking someone without startling them, low, controlled, the tone that shared quarters experience had taught him to use when the waking needed to be gentle. "Caliph, you're in the wrong bunk." The response was immediate, which told him she had not been asleep. The immediacy communicated that she was conscious, that she was aware of her position, and that the awareness had been present before his waking. Meaning, she had not stumbled into the bunk in sleep-fogged confusion and remained unconscious of the error, but had at some point become conscious of the error and had remained where she was despite the consciousness. "I am aware," she said. Her voice was the voice that 6 months of shared quarters had made familiar, the precise, measured, tonally controlled voice that her professional communication used, the voice that carried information with the minimum emotional content that communication permitted. The voice was present. The voice was in his bunk. The voice was in his bunk and was aware of being in his bunk. "You're in my bunk," he repeated, because the repetition seemed warranted by the response's inadequacy, the response acknowledging the situation without addressing it, the awareness confirmed without the correction that the awareness should have produced. "I am aware of whose bunk I am in. Okay, so I am not moving." The sentence arrived in the dark compartment with the specific, flat finality that Caliph applied to statements that were conclusions rather than positions. The vocal quality of someone who had assessed a situation and reached a determination, and whose determination was not subject to negotiation, because the assessment that produced it was complete, and the completeness left no space for the revision that negotiation would require. She pulled the thermal blanket tighter. The motion was small, the adjustment of fabric conducted with the economic precision that characterized her physical movements in all contexts, but the motion's meaning was disproportionate to its scale. The tightening of a blanket communicating more than the tightening of a blanket should have been able to communicate, because the tightening was performed by a person whose every previous physical interaction with his personal space had been governed by the absolute boundary maintenance that the tightening was violating. "You're not moving," Declan said. "Correct. You, Caliph Vorsaran, who once asked me to relocate my data tablet because it was 6 inches past the midline of the shared storage unit. The storage unit's spatial allocation is equitable by design. The 6-inch encroachment was a violation of the allocation's equity. You relocated my coffee cup because it was on your side of the environmental control panel. The panel's controls are divided by user. The cup was obstructing my thermal adjustment interface. You are currently in my bunk, pressed against my side, using my blanket. Yes, and you're not moving. I am not moving." The dark compartment held the conversation with the acoustic intimacy that small spaces provided. The sound contained, close, the words carrying the particular quality that words carried when the people speaking them were within arm's reach, and when the proximity made the words feel larger than their content, because the proximity added the physical dimension that distance would have subtracted. "I need you to explain this," Declan said, and his voice was careful, the specific care that people applied to conversations that were simultaneously absurd and potentially serious, and that required the navigation of both qualities without diminishing either. Because my current understanding of you as a person does not contain a framework for this situation, and the framework's absence is making the situation very confusing. Caliph was silent. The silence was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had something to say, and whose saying of it required the overcoming of a resistance that the something's content generated. The resistance of a person whose professional identity was organized around the projection of competence and control, encountering a situation that required the admission of something that the identity classified as weakness, and that the admission would make visible. My thermoregulatory system, she said, and the words were produced with the specific, grudging quality of information extracted against the provider's preference. Each word released as though the releasing cost something, the cost being the pride that the information's content required her to spend. Is in failure. In failure. Calithi thermoregulation is an active metabolic process. The process maintains body temperature within the range that our physiology requires through continuous metabolic expenditure. Under normal conditions, the expenditure is manageable. The metabolic cost is within the budget that normal caloric intake and normal physiological function provide. Under sustained stress, she paused. The pause was the cost being paid. The process fails. Sustained physiological stress, the cortisol equivalent, the metabolic drain that crisis management imposes on biological systems operating at maximum capacity for extended periods, exhausts the metabolic budget that thermoregulation draws from. The budget is depleted, the process cannot maintain function, the body's temperature drops, and the drop is. She stopped. The stopping was not the completion of the sentence, but the arrival at the part of the sentence that the pride could not release without additional cost, and the additional cost was being calculated against the alternative, which was silence. And the silence was the option that 6 months of maintained distance would have selected, and that the current situation, specifically, the warmth, was making the selection's value less than the warmth's value. The drop is severe, she said, and chronic, and the word was produced with visible effort, the effort of someone whose vocabulary for personal vulnerability was underdeveloped because the vocabulary had not been exercised. Miserable. You've been cold. I have been cold for 9 days. The crisis management period, the equipment failures, the data corruption, the extended shifts began 9 days ago. My thermoregulatory failure began approximately 2 days after the crisis period initiated. For 7 days, I have been unable to maintain adequate body temperature through my own metabolic function. The environmental systems in the upper bunk are calibrated for standard thermoregulatory function. They provide supplemental warmth that a functioning system can use to close the gap between metabolic output and required temperature. My system is not functioning. The supplemental warmth is insufficient. The gap is not closing. The cold is constant, and worsening. The failure compounds the metabolic expenditure required to attempt thermoregulation in a failing system produces additional stress, which depletes additional metabolic budget, which deepens the failure, which increases the cold. The cycle is self-reinforcing. She was pressed against his side. The pressing was present throughout the explanation, not increasing, not adjusting, but maintained with the steady, deliberate contact of a body that had found what it needed, and whose finding had produced the specific, physiological refusal to relinquish the finding that biological need generated when the need was severe enough to override the conscious preferences that the need's owner typically maintained. I entered the wrong bunk, she said. Night shift exhaustion. The fatigue of 12 consecutive hours of crisis management produced a navigational error. I entered the lower bunk instead of the upper. The error was she paused. The pause was brief. The honesty was expensive. The error was genuine. The decision to remain was not an error. The decision to remain. I woke approximately 30 minutes before you did. I became aware of the navigational error. I became aware that I was in your bunk. I became aware that you were. The sentence encountered a word that required selection, and the selection required a moment that the moment's content made precise. Warm. Warm. Humans generate metabolic heat at a rate that exceeds calithy output by a significant factor. Your species' warm-blooded physiology, the continuous metabolic furnace that your evolution built for temperature maintenance on a planet with extreme climatic variation, produces thermal output that is, from the perspective of a calithy in thermoregulatory failure, extraordinary. You radiate heat, continuously, unconsciously. The thermal environment of this bunk, the enclosed space, the retained warmth, the U is the first thermal environment in 9 days that has been sufficient to reach the cold that has settled into my core. I'm a space heater. You are a biological thermal generation system with an output approximately equivalent to a dedicated heating unit, and the output is, she stopped. The stopping was the specific arrest of a sentence that was approaching emotional territory, that the sentence's speaker was not prepared to enter, and that the approaching required the speaker to decide whether to continue into the territory or to retreat to the analytical safety that the sentence had departed from. The output is effective. I have been shivering for 7 days. I am not shivering now. She was not shivering. She was still, the specific, settled stillness of a body that had stopped the involuntary tremor that thermoregulatory failure produced, and that the stopping communicated, more than any words could, how severe the shivering had been. The body's relief at its absence visible in the quality of the stillness, the settled quality of some. He thought about the past 9 days through the lens of the information the last 10 minutes had provided, and the lens restructured the memory. Calith's increased quietness during the crisis period, previously interpreted as professional focus, now recognizable as the conservation of energy that a failing thermoregulatory system demanded. Her slightly reduced movement efficiency, previously interpreted as fatigue from extended shifts, now recognizable as a body operating at suboptimal temperature, and whose suboptimal temperature made movement require more effort than the movement should have required. The specific, small gesture he had observed 3 days ago, Calith pressing her hands against the environmental control panel's thermal adjustment interface, the gesture reading as temperature calibration, and now readable as a person pressing cold hands against the warmest surface available. 7 days of being cold. Not the cold that environmental temperature produced, the cold that biological failure produced, the cold that came from inside, the cold that no external adjustment could fully address because the cold's origin was the body's inability to generate sufficient warmth rather than the environment's failure to provide it. The cold that she had been managing, enduring, through 9 days of crisis shifts and professional performance, and the maintained distance that the ship's crew interpreted as personality, and that was, in part, the wall that hid the shivering. Calith, if you are going to ask me to leave, I would prefer you not ask. I would prefer you simply inform me, and I will. Her voice was controlled. The control was present, maintained, the same measured precision that characterized all her communication. But beneath the control, audible to someone who was lying beside her in the dark and who was close enough to hear what distance would have obscured, there was something that the control was containing. The specific, small, involuntary tremor that cold produced in a voice when the cold was severe enough, and the warmth that was alleviating it was threatened. I will go. I'm not asking you to leave. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. The preceding silences had been the pauses of a conversation in progress, the intervals between statements that the conversation structure produced. This silence was the silence of a person who had been expecting one thing and had received another, and whose receiving required a recalibration of the expectations framework before the receiving could be processed. You are not asking me to leave. I'm not asking you to leave. You're cold. You've been cold for 9 days. My bunk is warm because I am, as you've identified a biological thermal generation system. The thermal generation is not diminished by your presence. The heat I produce is sufficient for one person and is not insufficient for two. You are not shivering for the first time in 9 days. The logical analysis that produced your decision to stay is, by any reasonable assessment, sound. The logical analysis also produces a social situation that. The social situation is two colleagues sharing a bunk on a research vessel, because one colleague's biology is in failure, and the other colleague generates enough heat to address the failure. The social situation is a maintenance issue. I'm an engineer. I address maintenance issues. You are classifying my thermoregulatory failure as a maintenance issue. I am classifying the solution to your thermoregulatory failure as within my professional scope. The system U is operating below optimal temperature. The available corrective resource, me, is adjacent and producing surplus capacity. Applying the surplus capacity to the suboptimal system is standard engineering practice. You are describing me as a suboptimal system. I am describing your thermoregulation as a suboptimal system. I am describing you as a colleague who is cold and who should go to sleep. The silence that followed was the silence of a person whose defensive architecture, the 6 months of maintained distance, the boundaries, the professional precision that kept the world at arm's length, had encountered a response that the architecture was not designed for, and that the response's nature made the architecture uncertain about whether to maintain or adjust. The architecture was designed for rejection. The architecture was designed for judgment. The architecture was designed for the specific social consequences that vulnerability produced when the vulnerable person's professional identity depended on appearing invulnerable. The architecture was not designed for a man who classified her biological failure as a maintenance issue and told her to go to sleep. She did not go to sleep immediately. She lay in the dark beside a man who was warm and who had told her to stay, and whose telling had been delivered with the specific, straightforward, uncomplicated warmth that characterized his communication in all contexts, and that she had spent 6 months maintaining distance from because the warmth was the thing that the distance was designed to manage. And the management had been effective, until tonight when the management encountered a biological need that exceeded its capacity. The crew will, she began. The crew doesn't know, doesn't need to know, and won't know unless you tell them. If the situation continues, the situation continues. Your thermoregulatory failure is a medical condition. The condition requires thermal support. The thermal support is available. The availability is not contingent on social assessment. You are being unreasonably practical about this. I am being exactly as practical as the situation requires. The situation requires a warm bunk and a person who doesn't ask questions that the person they're asking is clearly uncomfortable answering. I can provide both. Both. Warm bunk, discretion, standard engineering deliverables. The sound she made was small, a vocal production that his 6 months of auditory familiarity with her communication patterns had never encountered, a sound that existed outside the catalog of her professional vocal output because the sound was not professional. The sound was the Calithi equivalent of a laugh, or, more precisely, the Calithi equivalent of the sound that preceded a laugh, the involuntary vocalization that humor produced when the humor was unexpected, and when the unexpected quality made the humor stronger than the humor's content alone warranted. The sound was small and soft and produced in the dark by a person who was, for the first time in 6 months of shared quarters, not maintaining the distance that defined her presence. Standard engineering deliverables, she repeated, and the repetition carried the sound's residual warmth, the vocal quality that the almost laugh had produced, and that the repetition retained. I have a professional reputation to maintain. Reliable thermal output and operational discretion. She was quiet. The quiet was different from her standard silence. The standard silence was maintained, deliberate, the silence of a person who chose not to speak. This quiet was the settled, gradual quiet of a person whose body was warm, and whose warmth was producing the specific, progressive relaxation that warmth produced in a body that had been cold for 9 days, and whose relief at the warmth's presence was expressing itself through the systematic release of the tension that 9 days of shivering had built. "Thank you," she said. The words were small. The words were, by the standards of her professional communication, inadequate, 2 words carrying insufficient informational content to constitute a complete communication in the framework that her professional vocabulary used. But the words were not operating in the professional framework. The words were operating in the personal framework that existed beneath the professional one, the framework that the distance had concealed and that the warmth was making visible. And in the personal framework, 2 words were sufficient because the 2 words were honest, and the honesty carried what elaboration would have diluted. "Go to sleep, Caliph." She went asleep. The going was gradual, the progressive relaxation deepening, the body's tension releasing in stages as the warmth performed the work that 9 days of shivering had made necessary, each stage bringing her closer to the rest that the thermoregulatory failure had been denying her, and that the warmth was restoring. Her breathing slowed. Her body settled, the thermal acquisition posture, softening from the deliberate, purposeful contact of a person acquiring heat to the relaxed, settled contact of a person who was warm and whose warmth had made the deliberation unnecessary. Declan lay in the dark. The woman beside him was asleep. The woman beside him was the ship's ice queen, the cold, precise, boundary-maintaining professional whose professional exterior was apparently, in addition to being personality, also physiology. The sternness partially, the compensation of a person whose body was chronically uncomfortable, and whose discomfort's management required the energy that the sternness represented, and whose sternness was, viewed through the lens of the past 10 minutes. Less a wall designed to keep people out and more, a wall designed to keep the shivering in. The wall was down, not demolished, down for the night, lowered by the specific combination of biological need and thermal proximity that the night had produced. The woman behind the wall was cold and tired and pressed against his side with the trusting, settled quality of a person who had been told to stay, and who was staying, and whose staying was the most vulnerable thing she had done in 6 months, and whose vulnerability was being met with warmth and discretion, and the classification of the entire situation as a maintenance issue, which was, he recognized, the most practical and the kindest framing available, and which was, he also recognized, not quite the complete truth of the situation, because the complete truth included the recognition that the woman pressed against his side was a person he had been quietly appreciating for 6 months from the other side of a distance that the distance had made safe to appreciate from, and that the distance's collapse was producing. In addition to the thermal exchange that the situation's practical framing described, something else. The something else could wait. The something else would still be there in the morning, when the night cycle ended and the lights came up, and the question of what the night's thermal arrangement meant in the broader context of 2 people's shared quarters and shared work and shared ship became a question that the daylight required them to address. For now, the situation was what the situation's practical framing described. A warm bunk, a cold colleague, and the standard engineering deliverable of surplus thermal capacity applied to a suboptimal system. He adjusted the thermal blanket. The adjustment was small. The coverage extended to ensure that both bodies were within the blanket's thermal envelope. The adjustment performed with the practical, uncomplicated care that the adjustment's function required, and that the function's simplicity made available. He went asleep. The going was easier than he expected. The body beside him warm now instead of cold. The stillness of her sleeping form, the specific, comfortable stillness of a person who was resting rather than shivering. The compartment's night cycle quiet holding them, both in the dark with the settled, intimate quality that shared sleep produced when the sharing was comfortable, and the comfort was mutual.